Ottawa, Canada's capital. It's the Computer Podcast. Hello, I'm your host, Norman Jack, and with me, my co-host as usual, George Valenzuela. George, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Norm. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you very much. Summer has arrived, at least in this part of the world, with some hot, humid weather around, and
Indeed.
sure is better than 40 below with the wind. So
ask a penguin. We'll
I'll
see.
take it any day.
That's true. That's Paul Middleveen from The Trailing Edge, our special guest today. We also have another special guest coming on later on as we talk about our main topic of the show, and that's what you can do with all those cool virtual assistants out there, Google Home, Amazon Alexa, and such. We'll be concentrating on Google Home because that's what most of us have experience with, but you know, the procedures that you follow with this are generally applicable to any of those virtual assistants out there, and it's amazing some of the things you can do with it. Lots of things going on in the world of the internet and computers and etc. this past week as well. George, you probably heard of this massive, huge hole in Google Chrome extensions. I guess there are something like 70 of them that have been put up by various companies purporting to do things with your Chrome browser that's supposed to make your life easier, but apparently have been digging and mining all your personal information out there.
Yeah, and again, this is just a typical way of getting into a user's sensitive information. Is anything that gets you onto a user's browsing session is, just a rich minefield of personal information, potential personal information, passwords, keystroke logging, controlling your camera, your microphone, depending on what the user is doing in the browser session. So, I mean, it's not surprising that the browser with the #1 market share is being targeted by malicious users for that purpose, right? You're generally safe, I think, if you stick to kind of the more well-known extensions. It's when you start going off onto the I don't want to call it the deep web because that's kind of misleading. Just down, there's so many extensions available for a browser like Google Chrome. When you start getting down into the lower tiers of offerings, that's when the risk kind of elevates. And given the fact that there's, how many you said, hundreds or no, less than 100?
Yeah, I think there were over 70 they said they pulled.
Yeah, and there must be, 10,000, 20,000 extensions out there. Chances are that you're okay, but you might want to do a review, check to make sure you don't have any of the extensions installed, and take appropriate action, get rid of it for sure. Yeah,
Now those extensions are basically plugins, I guess, that you use on Google Chrome to be able to access different websites or do different things without having to go through some laborious web process, correct?
I mean, a typical extension, for example, would be if you're a user of online web editing tool. So let's say you're going to you're writing blogs. So you're on blogger.com. Well, somebody might write extensions to be able to change fonts quicker, or to highlight certain words, or to integrate spelling, to enhance a website's functionality without having to wait for the website to do it. Essentially, is what an extension could do, right? It could also integrate with services like Zoom, for example, or other online services. So it can really do almost anything. The problem is that once an extension is installed and you give it permission to do something, if that extension is malicious, you've already given it permission to do certain things. And if, for example, it can view your screen, well, it could very easily take the next step and start sniffing out your passwords. So as you type in a password, it could just record those keystrokes, send it to some malicious website and say, hey, we've got this person's Facebook password or Twitter password or whatever. So, you've got to take precautions for things like that and make sure that your extensions are the maybe more popular ones, right?
Yeah. Now, Awake Security, which is the firm that did the scan of all these extensions and alerted Google to the problems, says most of the ones that were problems purportedly were there to warn users about whether they were questioning or visiting questionable websites, which sounds kind of ironic, or were extensions that would allow you to convert files from one format to another. Two very popular types of extensions and ways that people want to use extensions to be able to speed up this, oh gosh, I better not look at this website, it may be dangerous, or I want to quickly convert a file from one format to another. Those are two relatively popular uses for extensions too.
Yeah, exactly. Extensions, the word says it there, right? So you've got your typical web browser, you want to extend the functionality to something else. you install an extension, right? Again, it could be as innocuous as just changing the background color of all the pages that you're on, to something like converting file types or downloading YouTube videos where you're not normal. It's a functionality that the website itself doesn't provide. The extension may be able to provide that, through its code, and you hope that the extension authors are not malicious, right?
Yeah.
And in many cases, that they are. So that's unfortunate.
Elsewhere in the news, of course, DC superheroes are coming to your favorite podcast service. Spotify signed a deal with DC Entertainment to distribute an original slate of narrative scripted podcasts exclusively to Spotify. Financial details weren't disclosed, but apparently you'll get superheroes on your podcast service in the next little while. Once they get this deal done and the podcast's up and running. This is like old time radio shows coming back.
Yeah, and this comes just after they signed Joe Rogan, right, to an exclusive podcast hosting deal, and that was worth $100 million or more, I believe. It was a huge deal. So Spotify's really making a play here to own not just the music streaming market, but the podcast market as well. I think its biggest rival would be iTunes. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
So these two look set to offer the consumer amazing choices. It's fantastic. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah, it is, and it's kind of neat to see this sort of stuff. I mean, in the old days, of course. When I was working way out in the prairies and it was nighttime, one of the ways to keep yourself awake while you were driving on those long, flat miles of highway was to tune in a radio station that had some of the old-time radio dramas on.
Right.
You don't have to do that anymore. Once this service gets up and running, it should be pretty cool. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Well, Facebook has decided to take down some campaign ads launched by Donald Trump's re-election committee that featured Nazi symbols. This is a first for Facebook because, as we know, Mark Zuckerberg has been reluctant to, quote, censor, unquote, things that the president is saying on social media. But I guess there were a number of ads posted with an upside-down red triangle, which has been a Nazi symbol for those who still believe in that particular ideology, because it was the same triangle that the Nazis used to identify political prisoners in concentration camps. And a lot of people are saying that this is a sort of a subtle jab by right-wing groups to try and get their ideology across. But interesting that Facebook finally takes action on something like this, considering the stand that Mark Zuckerberg has been taking over the last many months.
Yeah, it's not quite subtle stance, in my opinion, but it is very sad to see the way politics is devolving south of us. It's becoming, just when you think it couldn't be more divisive than it already has been, it just keeps getting worse and worse. And calling the other side a Nazi seems to be used on both sides. Both sides of the fence are calling the other side Nazis. So, I mean, the sad part is nobody on the other on one side can see the other side's perspective. There's very few fence sitters anymore. There's very few centrists. There's very few people with any sense of nuance or shades of gray. It's really sad. I don't know where it's going to end, but I'm not enjoying it so far. It's terrible. Yeah.
Well, I noticed a lot of my Facebook friends have been taking extended breaks from Facebook and from Twitter too, because they just they can't handle it anymore.
Yeah,
and I don't blame them at all.
Agreed.
Well, now speaking of social media, what could go wrong here, George? Twitter has announced that it's going to be allowing verbal tweets.
Oh boy, are they going to be called Vweets?
Vweets, yeah. They don't have a name for them yet, but apparently they've started allowing a limited group of iOS users to create tweets with their voice. In the coming weeks, they're going to roll it out to all iOS users. It's going to be 140 seconds long, which, when you typed out characters, is not a long time. 140 characters in the old Twitter limits really limited what you could say. 140 seconds, we being on the radio know 140 seconds is like forever.
That's a long time.
Yeah. So it's really weird. But apparently people won't be able to respond to voice tweets with their own voice tweet.
Okay.
So they'll have to stick to the 280 characters and type in their responses like this. But
All I can say, Norm, is that I'll be happy to see people, instead of typing out LOL, actually hearing people laughing out loud. That'll be a nice change, right? So maybe people will learn to spell again and use punctuation. Now, who am I kidding? Of course not.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how fast they can roll it out everywhere and how popular this is and whether it actually catches on. I'm not sure that people are going to be willing to sit down and listen to 140 seconds worth of audio because, as I say, that's, you're looking at over 2 minutes, 2 minutes and 20 seconds worth of audio. That's kind of long and boring, I think.
I mean, it's just blurring the lines between the different platforms, right? It's Instagram has the ability now to do video. Twitter's basically got video now. They've got audio. They've got text. All of the different platforms seem to be, blurring the lines between each other, and they're just kind of meeting somewhere in the middle, where you're just sharing ideas now at this point, right? So it's not a surprise. It's not a huge deal. And technically, is it a big leap? We'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'm not interested in Twitter that much anymore because of all the garbage that's going on right now. So I can't see this, garnering any additional interest in the platform, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The only good thing that a couple of people that I've heard discuss about this is that when they're sending emails or texts, either the opinion can be misunderstood, and that when you hear somebody's voice, you tend to better understand what they're trying to say to you. So in some cases, a lot of people in the government anyway are saying that they're appreciating verbal communication versus the email, that communication gets lost a little bit. So that's one of the things they're dealing with lately, and say they might be looking forward to this voice Twittery thing.
I'm sure they'll find a way to mess it up somehow. But
Exactly. Well, listen, today the main topic of discussion is those personal assistants you have at home. Google Home and Amazon Alexa proving to have been very popular, and especially with more of us working out of the home right now during the pandemic restrictions. There's a lot more that you can do with those two devices. With us today to give us a handle on what he's done with Google Home specifically, Andrew Jack, my son. So, let's make sure that we understand there is a family connection here. And he's had some rather interesting experiences with Google Home. One of the neat things about, and we'll talk about Google Home again because most of us have had experience with that, but most of these ideas are applicable to any of those machines that you can buy, is that you can go beyond the general things. I mean, I use mine to activate a couple of power switches that I have, for example, so I can turn on these lights, I can set up programs for it, I can turn on the coffee pot, all that sort of stuff. You can go in and you can say, what's the weather in Ottawa today? What's the weather in Timbuktu? Read me the news headlines. All of that sort of stuff is, play my favorite radio station. All of that stuff is relatively and generally accepted, but there are lots of other things that you can do with this as well. George, you make use of Google's Assistant, the app at home as well, don't you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've got a Google Nest Hub. The Office Display Hub.
Oh, yeah.
With a screen. I've got a bunch of Google Minis around. I even use the Google Nest Wi-Fi points, which are Google home speakers in and of themselves. My favorite application for them, is quite simply, it doesn't even need to be a Google Home for this, but is just to cast my music to it, right? So rather than listening on headphones, if I'm in the kitchen and I'm making dinner, I'll just throw my playlist on my phone, cast it to the nearest Google Home, and just listen to it that way, right? I talk to it, ask it questions. What's the temperature? What's the weather? I actually have one next to my bed, and I tell it to play a couple of podcast tracks for me before I go to sleep. All that kind of stuff. It's very useful. It's almost I don't want to say ubiquitous right now. I'm not that used to it yet, but it's pretty cool. The one thing I haven't leveraged is the smart home initiative, right? So I don't have a lot of IoT devices in my home, and that's the one part that I'm lacking experience with. So I look forward to building that portfolio, that part of my home portfolio up, right? The smart home part.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Andrew, what about you? You've had some interesting experiences getting things together, and you've got your 4-year-old daughter Emily involved too, which is kind of cool. She'll grow up in a world where you don't seem to have to hit any switches or anything like that. But what motivated you to take this particular approach? Because you've gone sort of beyond just the basic commands.
Yeah, so I've had a little bit of time to play around with the Google Home Minis that I've had for about 6 months now. And one thing that we really get a lot of use out of in our house is media playing. So we don't have cable TV, or to come to think of it, I think we do, but we don't use it. The vast majority of our television in the house is through streaming apps like Netflix or Disney Plus or Amazon Prime Video. And we find it very useful to be able to control our media through the Google Home Minis that we have scattered throughout the house.
Oh, that's cool. So you're able just to tell it to broadcast certain shows to your television set?
So here's one limitation that I have found. No matter what streaming platform I'm playing on, be it Disney Plus or Amazon Prime or YouTube, I'm able to pause and play whatever I'm currently watching on TV. However, if you're using Netflix, if that's your primary source of media, it gets even better because you can pair your Netflix account with your Google Home application, and you can actually give it a command to play whatever show or movie that you want. So I can just say, hey, Google, I won't say it because I don't want to.
You don't want to activate it, yes.
But you can tell it to play Star Trek The Next Generation on Netflix. And what it'll do is, because I also have voice recognition on, it recognizes my voice versus my wife's voice. And it'll actually go to my specific Netflix profile and resume whatever TV show or movie I requested from where I left off.
Wow.
Yep.
That's cool. Now, what are some of the other things you've done with it as well? Because you've gone beyond you ask it what the weather is and what the temperature is and all that sort of normal stuff. But what are some of the other things you've done? You're using them as communications tools between minis as well.
Yeah, so we have 3 Google Home Minis, one on each floor of the house. And we can use them sort of as an intercom system through the broadcast command. And when you ask it to broadcast something, it'll prompt you to record a little message, and that'll be played on all the Google Home speakers throughout the house. So you can announce that dinner's ready, or if you wanted to ask a question of someone who's in the basement and you're up in the bedroom, you can just have a little shout out instead of screaming down the stairs. And that's really quite handy too, because then that person can choose to reply as well, and you can have a little intercom conversation.
That's kind of cool. Now, can you make it squeal with feedback, though, when you send a message like that? And the reason I ask that is when I was young, I was lucky enough to live in a newly built home where my parents had them install wires for an intercom system. And one of my favorite tricks used to be to get feedback from the one in the kitchen and then blast it upstairs to the bedrooms to wake my sister up. But I guess you can't do that with Google Home Minis, huh?
No, I haven't tried that yet. No.
Oh, okay.
There's your weekend project, Andrew.
There you go. There you go.
I'm sure there's some kind of annoying sound that I can get it to play if I wanted to.
Yeah. Now, what else have you been doing with it as well that's sort of off the beaten track? Anything that sort of jumps out at you as being really convenient for you?
Well, one thing I really like is setting up routines. And you can set up routines through the Google Home app by choosing one of the presets, or you can create your own. You can set up a specific trigger phrase, whatever you want, and then you can choose which specific commands you want it to execute when you announce that trigger phrase. So, for example, one of the most convenient ones that I use is a bedtime routine. We have not only the Chromecasts, but a couple of smart plugs throughout the house, including a special weatherproof outdoor one that we have in the garage for our Christmas lights. And what I have it set to is when I'm in bed at night, I'm usually watching something on TV. All I have to do is tell my Google good night. And what it does is it asks me what time I want to set my alarm the next morning. It will then also turn off or stop casting whatever I'm currently watching on the current TV. It will turn off my living room light and my outdoor lights if they're on, and it will also play some white noise for me so that I can get to sleep.
Wow. Does it tuck you in as well? I guess not, eh?
No.
No, that's really cool. Now, where did you discover all this? Is this basically just doing Google searches for things you can do with your home minis and such?
Really just playing around within the Google Home app itself. Once you load onto the main screen, there's a button right there that says routines. You can tap on that and then manage routines, and then that's where you can customize the little custom commands that you want it to execute.
Oh, that's very cool. Now, Paul, do you use Google Home at home or even at the office for that matter?
Not in the office, but at home, yeah, we've been using about the same, the last 6 or 8 months, and similar things. We have some routines set up, but also, turning on and off various appliances in the home and TVs, setting up messages. Me and my wife, again, with me out and her a lot at home, sometimes we miss each other. So at the house, so we'll leave messages for each other, and as soon as we get home, Google will let us know what I need to get for groceries, or et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, they've been fantastic.
That's really neat.
One of the things I've found that's really spooky, and I don't use it that often because it tends to spook the bejesus out of me or anybody else in my house if I'm doing it, is that with, Brian Drew was talking about broadcasting messages. You can do that from a distance because you can use the Google Home app on your mobile phone to broadcast to your Google Home minis at home, which is kind of interesting. So I could be anywhere outside of the house, launch my home application, and do a broadcast to the machines in my house, and then it just suddenly speaks. So, unless you've warned somebody at home that you're about to message them, it can sound really spooky to have somebody's voice go echoing around the house when you know they're not there. It's very, very weird. But it's effective because it works. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this, George. I think the future is going to be more of these routines. There are certain things that they still can't quite accomplish, but I think it's only a matter of time. IFTTT, which is the program you can use to create if-then functions associated with various commands you can have. That has been relatively limited so far in its development of these types of connections, but I think that's going to pick up as more people contribute to it. We're going to see, I think, especially with everybody who's been sitting at home the last couple of months, I think we're going to see a lot more of these develop. And, the Jetsons smart home of the future, I think, is probably a lot closer than we think with something like this.
Well, it's made the transition from interesting novelty to, I wouldn't say, required outfit, but it's certainly a useful tool now, at least, right? One of the things I did like when Andrew mentioned the voice recognition is if I say to Google to call mom, it will call my mom, whereas if my wife says call mom, it will actually call her mom because it recognizes her voice is different from mine, and we have different contacts. So that's kind of a neat use of voice recognition too, so that's pretty convenient.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's all the time we've got on the show today. I want to thank my special extra guest, Andrew Jack, for dropping by today. Good to talk to you, sir. And Paul Middleveen from the Trailing Edge as well. Thanks for dropping by today. Glad to see the stores reopened, and keep socially distant out there, though, Paul. Make sure. I'm sure you will.
Thank you.
And, of course, don't forget, next week is our Tech Talk show. So please email us your questions about problems or issues that you're having. Just send them to Computer Podcast or The Computer Podcast at gmail.com. You can check out our Facebook page as well, facebook.com/The Computer Podcast, and our blog as well at thecomputerpodcast.com. And don't forget, you can download us off of YouTube, our YouTube channel, or of course you can subscribe to the podcast on any one of your favorite podcast services. So George, we'll see you next week.
We'll see you, Norm.
And we'll see you next week on the Computer Podcast. Interesting programming.